Hello and to another episode of Advertising Alpha. And just quickly, the intent of this is and the really description of this conversation being alpha is a finance term. So it's the idea of how an investment strategy or trader does relative towards, the benchmark of the market or kind of the average of what, might be doing that kind of investment thesis. So the idea here is like, what are these kind of unique tactics and strategies we might be using to basically quote unquote beat the market, do a better job than other agencies or better job than other brands. So an important thing that 8th Street did this year was roll out server to server tracking for our ad platform. So Meta and Google ads. And we found huge success with Popsixle. And so want to bring on Noah, who is a lifelong digital marketer, data engineer, and social media strategist. He ran paid social ad buying teams at Havas Media before entering the startup world. As the CEO of Popsicle, he's committed to helping Shopify brands and e-commerce businesses get better ad performance with better data and better ad buying best practices. So Noah, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm excited to have you. Yeah, super pumped to have this conversation. And so, we're going to hop right into it. Basically have 3 questions for you, and then we'll just talk about each of those questions. The first one being, can you explain the importance and functionality of server-to-server tracking as if you were speaking to, maybe like a new direct-to-consumer e-commerce brand?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in its simplest form, server-to-server tracking is sort of like the next generation of pixels. So pixels were a browser-based technology. They don't work the way they used to work anymore because of all the privacy changes. So server-side tracking, you're sending your data directly from one server directly to another. It can't be interrupted by an ad blocker. It's much more likely to get there intact, and you can send a lot more information like a hashed email or a hashed phone number that you wouldn't be allowed to send in a compliant way through the browser. But in really simple layman's terms, brands need lots of data right now to feed the machine learning systems, to feed the algorithms. Because of all the privacy changes, they're not getting the data that they need with previous technologies. So server to server tracking is a way to kind of bring your technology up to the latest and greatest and continue to get the data that you need.
Awesome. And, one talk track that I constantly say to brands and the need for this is these ad platforms have changed really radically in the last couple of years. So they're heavily, heavily, heavily dependent on machine learning. And machine learning, it's only as smart as the data that you're feeding it, right? And the data sets you're providing. But, Google Ads, for example, there's a big push towards PMax, which is basically just allowing Google to distribute your ads across a bunch of different channels, right? And you just give it assets and it figures it out. Meta, it's like Advantage plus broad targeting. It's just allowing Meta, you give it assets, the creative and budget, and that's kind of it. And then it figures it out. Why is, first of all, it's like machine learning is how these platforms run today. And there's not much you can do to kind of tactically manage campaigns that will give you an advantage because you're dependent on this. But, you as a data engineer, can you kind of further double
Yeah.
click into this and explain like really what's going on? Because I'm not, and I just know this in these kind of, broad concepts, but why is it so important from a machine learning standpoint to have more data, and really what is it doing, and where have you seen this be a significant advantage?
Yeah. So ultimately, I want to talk about how machine learning has transformed the industry of digital ads. And I would say in one way, it's made things simpler. In another way, it's made things a lot more powerful and capable, but those are not the same. So I want to unpack that. So when I think of how it's made things simpler, it's actually very deceptive. A lot of amateur ad buyers, people who are not professional, they're self-taught, or there's just a brand owner saying, oh, I can do this myself. The barrier of entry is a lot lower than ever before. So, 10 years ago, you would have to be trained for a month before you could even open up a Google or Meta ad account because it was so complicated.
Mhm.
Now there's this deceptive sense of, oh, I just add a credit line. I just put my credit card down and I can just, put it on autopilot and it's going to go fine. So because it's so much simpler, it is creating this false perception that the game has gotten easier. But to your point about alpha, if you are a pro level user and now you're in the ring with all these amateurs, there are massive advantages you can take to win in that marketplace. The same with the stock market, right? Any retail investor can open up a Fidelity account, drop some
Yep.
money in it, and start, trying to bet against Warren Buffett. Good luck. Warren Buffett's going to eat your lunch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Particularly if it's from McDonald's. He likes McDonald's. No, so I'm joking, but here's what it really comes down to. We are human, and there's things that we're really good at. Machines are really good at other. This was actually my thesis in grad school, human-machine collaboration. How do you take advantage of both sides of it? So let's use creative as an example. If we were to fill a room with all the top creative directors from all the top agencies in the world, you could have a really interesting debate about what ad is going to work. And, it's about style and design and kerning and typography and, sensibility. And all these people are kind of proven experts in determining that. At the end of the day, I would go on record saying you can't predict what's going to work because the algorithm is going to decide for you. So if instead you check your ego at the door and you say, okay, it's not about my taste. It's not about my credentials. It's not about my experience. It's about me understanding the game that I'm sitting down at the table and playing.
Yeah.
What Meta actually cares about is creative diversity because it is going to figure out who's clicking, who's not, who's dwelling, who's not. And if you dwell and I dwell and it figures out we're both, white men on the East Coast between 30 and 45 or whatever, all of a sudden it's going to build a learning model where it's going to automatically find more people. And I'm using attributes that you can see. It's looking across hundreds of dimensions, just using data ranking and, pattern matching that humans can't even comprehend. So what you want to do is you want to feed that system with a lot of choices, a lot of variety, and then let it do what it does. It's going to find winners. It's going to find pattern matches. It's going to learn. It's going to adapt, and then it's going to scale. So if I let my creative directors cherry pick, what we think is the best creative, I'm actually holding back. I'm holding back that system by giving it less optionality. So that's just one example. You could say the same thing about targeting, about the different placement types, about building a real-time feedback loop. I mean, we could really dig into this, but I think the creative example, there's the biggest contrast between what us lowly humans think will work and then how the system is actually decision.
Yeah. It's a big thing for us is, we have this kind of testing, we have a balance between what we call big swings. So like as much variation as possible. And then we have iterations, right? Where we find a concept that's working well. And then we try to create as many variations within that one concept. But it's, the frustration I hear, and this is a little bit of a side topic, but I deal with it a lot, is brands don't actually like that variety in creative. And so there's so much that you put out there where it's like you really would be ideal to test in these machine learning models, but the brand is like, this is not on brand. I don't like this. I don't like how this looks. And so we can't even go out there and kind of give those learnings, which is always a little frustrating. But
yeah, and I could argue both ways. So like I started my agency career at a big creative agency that did brand strategy, and there's the whole room of, strategy briefs and the psychology. And I actually really respect that. And like, that's where I started my career. So I don't want to go so far and say, oh, none of that matters. Just do what works. I think
yeah,
Sarah Levinger is a voice in the space that's made, creative psychology very accessible. And I have huge respect for her approach. Now, the counterpoint is, I think a lot of times, again, it's about ego, right? So the ego of the ad buyer is saying, oh, I know what's best. The ego of the brand is saying, I'm going to protect my perception against my own interest. So, there's a pretty wide territory that you can explore when you're, are we going to use, the brand as the hero, or are we going to have a story that's about customer testimonials or about competitive differentiation or about the promotion or the features or the emotions, or there's so much rich territory on how to get someone to stop in the feed, click the ad and head to the website. But if a brand only wants to be the hero, only is willing to be the, the star of the show, it's their ego that's getting in the way of their performance. And,
yeah,
we're all people at the end of the day. And I'm not here to, point fingers, but all of us struggle with that challenge of what's best for business, what's best for this system or this machine versus how do I feel? And it's part of relationship management, right? You have
Yep.
to work through the feelings to try to get to the best outcomes.
Yep. I mean, at least for me, it's been a little bit of an ego check where for a long period, I've been doing this for a while. Now it's 10 years. And for a while, my skill as a media buyer was really valuable, but it's increasingly less valuable. And now it's like my skill has to be how to understand this machine learning process and how these algorithms work and really where these platforms are going. And also, too, as an agency owner, my skill now is more important. It's like, how do I scale the agency, not necessarily the media buying itself. But I just realized a lot of these kind of strategies and tactics and skills I had learned they're pretty obsolete at this point.
Or they're ubiquitous in a way. So it's like everyone has them. So therefore, that's not the selling point. But I think, you guys have done really well because you've adapted. So ultimately, you have to create value. And if it
Yeah,
used to be valuable of, oh, I'm a skilled operator. Well, now everyone's a skilled operator.
right.
So now you have to bring some different kind of value, which you've obviously figured out.
Yeah, speaking of that, so a lot of people will go for Meta specifically, they'll implement Meta's, conversions API or CAPI, right? And then they kind of have these basic pixel events associated with it. What is the issue here? Why is this misguided? Why should he use a tool like Popsicle?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's two categories I'm going to speak to. So one is the homegrown solution. So a lot of small and large enterprise businesses might have a developer on staff or a developer partner. They'll basically use like Happy Gateway and they'll like build their own conversions API, which is, totally available. That's what it's built for by Meta. What's really common for Shopify with that long tail of small and medium SMB businesses is they'll typically use the Shopify Facebook sales channel. They turn on data sharing, and that's sort of the free built-in CAPI connection between Shopify and Meta. So I'm assuming you're referring to both of those.
Yeah,
With the homegrown version, again, it's deceptively simple. You might think, oh, it's going to take me 20 hours to build. And you go through the documentation and you write some lines of code and you drag and drop and paste. And you can see that events are showing up on the other side of the system. It doesn't mean that that you're sending the data right. So for example,
mm,
the way that you hash an email, the way that you normalize a phone number, if you get either any of those details wrong, if you don't add the +1, if you don't make the email lowercase, if you drop or don't drop a period, because it's different for Google than it is for Meta. There's tons of these little details. And then it gets rolled up into a 64-digit number. So the number, Meta just says, oh, I received it. Hey, I got
yeah,
it. Nice job. My match rate, the match rate isn't actually determining if it's been received and matched to a person. It's just saying, oh, did you send email? Oh, you sent email. If you sent the wrong email 100% of the time, none of your data is going to match, but you would have a EMQ score of 9.0. So it's very,
interesting.
very easy to underestimate the complexity and get a false positive and say, hey, we're doing great. We knocked it out of the park. We got it done in record time. Meanwhile, you're sending data that's hurting your business and there's no indicator that that's happening. So that's what happens with the homegrown solutions. Much more common in terms of scale. There's 4.5 million Shopify stores. Hundreds of thousands of them are, spending enough on ads that they're paying attention to this. Their Meta rep, their Shopify rep, everyone said, turn on Shopify CAPI, set data sharing to maximum. This is a very common best practice with many, many businesses. These are the
Yep,
businesses we work with and we upgrade. So really what you're getting with the Shopify CAPI is a basic connection. It's fine. It's better than nothing, but it's not very good. So the biggest issue is it got built 4 or 5 years ago. It even
mm,
predates iOS 14. It was really meant for having these very complicated businesses with tons and tons of different SKUs, connect their catalog, send all these automated, individualized product IDs. That's what it was built for. And then when iOS 14 hit, Meta said, whoa, we already have this e-commerce thing. Let's roll it out for server side. And it never really got updated. So the Shopify Facebook sales channel predates iOS 14 and largely has not been updated. That's problem one. Problem two is it's just a basic relay. It's a very simple, free, one size fits all. What's changed in the last 5 years is the complexity of the average Shopify store. So if I have a subscription business, 1/3 of my orders are non-subscription, 1/3 are subscription starts, 1/3 are subscription renewals. Those are three very different swim lanes of data the system is going to send them all the same. That is going to cause huge problems for a subscription business. If you're using affiliates and you've got, all these affiliate links, many of those should never be attributed to a meta ad, and it's
Yeah.
going to get overcounted. Those are just a couple examples. But basically, it's just a very basic connector, and there's no nuance, there's no customization, and there's just a lot that's left on the table as a result. So the same way that I might run, I might buy a car and run the basic stock setup, or I might get some performance parts and kind of trick out my car. I want to drive the tricked out car. I want to get the alpha. I want to have that better outcome. And there's a lot of tools that just deliver a lot more.
Got it. And that's actually, I had no clue that the Shopify conversions API predated iOS 14. That's interesting. What happened? Can you tell us what happened in iOS 14?
Yeah. So this
Yeah.
is a very hot take, by the way, based on
Okay.
some kind of inside baseball conversation. Everyone remembers that at the end of March, iOS 14 came out, and this was March 2021, I believe.
Yeah.
iOS 14 comes out. If you're a Facebook advertiser, you have a Facebook account, you get a little pop-up, hey, this thing's coming, it might be bad. And it's kind of like Chicken Little, the
Yeah.
sky is falling, and everyone was like, it's going to be fine. So then around April, like all of a sudden, what ends up happening is a lot of the users of iOS devices got this pop-up, and it said, do you want to allow data tracking or not? And 92% of people said, no, I don't, right?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, Meta's sending all this data, and some of the devices are people who said, you can't track me, right? So it wasn't that bad in April. It got a lot worse around end of July and August. People are like, why? What was the delay? Oh, it was iOS 14.5. Wrong. It was not. The delay is that in 2018, 3 years earlier, Meta got fined $5 billion by the FTC. In addition to paying the fine, there is now, and there still is, an FTC oversight committee that forces Meta to follow all these compliance rules that they would not have followed on. So when iOS 14 first hit, you might opt out on one device, right? I've got WhatsApp, I've got Messenger, I've got Facebook, I've got Instagram, all these apps, I've got an iPad, I've got a laptop, I've got a work computer. If I opted out on one of those devices, all the other ones were fine. Well, by the time August came around, the FTC Oversight Committee said, hold on a second, Hal opted out of Instagram on his iPad, but now you have to count Hal as an opted out user system. That was the shoe that fell. And then all of a sudden it was like catastrophe, because now 50% of all users were on the do not track list, and all the data just disappeared. And this algorithm that needs data was like operating off of 50% fuel. So it was like absolutely catastrophic. So it was actually not that Apple changed the rules. It's that the FTC Oversight Committee forced Meta to follow the rules in a very strict way that kind of doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's funny. I feel like with a lot of big events, like kind of regardless, there's always a narrative that pops up that's very popular. And then there's like a more hidden narrative, if you understand the nuance of whatever that event was, that is actually more accurate in terms of like driving the event. And I do believe like it's most likely it was that. It's just Meta actually complying with that regulation. So,
and the downside, the downstream impact of what you just said, right? There's a popular narrative that was maybe oversimplified, as everyone thought iOS 14 wasn't bad. iOS 14.5 was terrible, which wasn't really true. And then there's been all this fear. Oh, they're releasing 15. Oh, they're releasing 16. And it's like, yeah, but all this time, it's really about Meta's internal policies. It's not really about Apple. And like the damage was already done. So not surprisingly, that was it. Like it was July, August of 2021 that really things got worse. None of the other changes have really been that impactful to Meta. So like what's been impactful is some of the changes to email, a lot of the changes to Google, which has, up to a 90-day look back window. The look back windows have shrunk with iOS 17. So there were other changes, but for Meta, it really goes back to that original summer.
Okay, makes sense. This is kind of the last additional question here, but do you have a good analogy or way of explaining just the importance of data velocity and data cleanliness and specificity in data when you're passing it back to these pixels and how it affects these machine learning algorithms. Because the biggest thing I tell clients is, hey, we're heavily dependent on this machine learning setup in these ad accounts. The less data they have, the dumber they are. And the slower it takes for them to like learn what campaigns are working, it slows down how we can scale campaigns. But I would love I don't know if you have one, but I would love a great analogy where it's like abundantly clear what's happening, or if you can kind of,
Yeah, no, I have one that I often say
okay,
on like sales calls.
yeah,
So think of that in Google's machine learning systems and algorithms as being like Formula One race car engines. Like literally, the best engineers in the world are being brought to task to build these incredible race engines.
yep,
And similarly, the smartest people in the world all got hired by Meta and Google in 2018 to build these systems that, yeah, now 6 years later, like it's changed the world. So if you're driving a Formula One race car and you're putting chocolate milk into the engine, that engine isn't going to perform the way it's meant to perform. If you put race fuel into it, it's going to perform amazing. So putting really bad fuel doesn't work. A second variation of that is, the algorithm needs to be able to see, it needs to be able to steer its decisioning, its machine learning model. And if you had your windshield 50% covered, if only 50% of the data is getting matched, you're like, I can kind of see, but you're almost steering blind. So by
yep,
restoring the flow of data, you can think of it as either upgrading the quality of the fuel or literally clearing the visibility of, now I can decision accurately because I have a crystal clear picture of who converted, who didn't, who do I find more of, who do I find less of.
yep, yeah, it's awesome. Great analogy. There we go. We got one. Um, what one thing quickly too, actually on this, how much does latency in like postbacks cause problems for machine learning, or just the latency and how like data is getting passed, back to these pixels?
So Meta lets you send the data back. Google lets you send the data back retroactively. Our system is set up to send it within seconds, but
Yeah,
you're allowed to send in batch once a day, once every 12 hours, like a whole bunch of events. So I don't like that. I know you can send it in real time and you can pass back the event time. So like, let's say I process an event at 101, the purchase occurred at 1, you can basically send it at 101 and say, this happened at 1 on the nose. That's our preference. There isn't really any published benefit to sending it sooner, but my concern is I want to inform the algorithm as much as possible. I
yep,
want to inform the auction as much as possible. And the auction is decisioning in real time. So
yep,
yes, if once a day the system can see, oh, you're converting at a high rate, your quality score goes up. That's great. But I want to send as much data as in real time as possible so that I can swim further upstream. But I don't think anyone really knows exactly what's inside the black box. So we do that because you want to kind of get as close as you can to real time. But it's almost impossible to quantify the benefit.
okay, interesting. Yeah, I always just thought because the auction, to your point, is happening in real time, you want to be passing data back in as fast as like time increments as you can. If you're waiting for like a day or a couple of days just to get that data passed back, it seems like that just latency and how the algorithms can learn about where to deliver ads would be pretty significant. It
I
would impact
assume
it
the
pretty
same thing.
significantly. Yeah.
There's no way to like prove that, but that is certainly logical.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting question for you. Because I'm going to call out some of your competitors, but can you, here's the thing. We went out and looked for a bunch of different server to server solutions. So we talked to, and we actually do work with Elevar. One of our clients is going to be implementing Blot Out. We've used Triple Whale's sonar feature. We haven't, but I've heard a lot of good things about Northbeam's Apex feature. And then we got Popsicle. So what is if you can kind of highlight the differences between all these different solutions and then what you think Popsicle does well.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first thing I'll say to just summarize the entire landscape is again, there's 4.5 million Shopify stores.
Yeah.
My assessment is that about 300,000 of them are our ideal customer profile, which is true small, medium businesses.
Hmm.
They're probably spending between $10,000 a month up to $1 million a month on ads, but those are all SMBs. There's only about 10,000 stores out of 4.5 million, which do the math. That is a very, very small percentage, like less than 1%. There's a very small percentage that are the $50 million plus dollars a year brand. So most agencies and most SaaS companies want to work with the $50 million a year. These are the brands like Obvi and Jones Road Beauty and Dr. Squatch and Allbirds and a lot of your customers. Like these are very cash flow positive businesses that are very sophisticated, that need the very best teams working for them. But if you think about it in terms of a meeting pool, that's like if every guy in the high school all wants to go after the same prom queen, like the
Yeah.
numbers aren't there. So we saw an opportunity and we said, well, hold on a second. 99% of all the SaaS companies are going after the same 1% of all of the customers. Why are we going to try to out Elevar? I'm not going to try to out blot out. We're going to build a differentiated product. So I would say that Elevar, blot out, Sonar, and Northbeam Apex are all going after the much bigger brands.
Okay.
So Elevar, for example, and they're trying to sell a Porsche 911. I'm trying to sell a Toyota Camry. And most businesses that we're going after don't need the 911. They don't need the manual double clutch transmission, right? They're fine pushing the start button, driving to work, getting there on time. So ultimately, the biggest differentiation is we do a lot less. We keep it a lot simpler. We keep it really easy. You don't need to have a data engineer on your team. You don't need to have a developer on your team. You don't need to set aside a full day or week or month to do your. It takes usually about 5 minutes. All the default settings work. We only send the data to Meta, TikTok, and Google. Elevar, blot out, these guys send it to, Snowflake and data warehouses and 38 different connectors that, again, you don't need if you're a true SMB. So that's sort of really what it's about. But specifically, I know a lot of these products pretty well. I'll share a little bit of heat. Maybe this is controversial, but so yes, Elevar I really respect them. They got acquired. They own a huge percentage of the market share at that top end of the market. But they started as a Google solution. So they are GTM based. GTM, in my opinion, is sort of a browser technology. So even though it's server-side tracking, it's still dependent on GTM and it's not pure server-side. I would also argue they're probably not as profound experts in Meta or TikTok because their roots in Google go back so far. That's my own take. They still have a great product. They're very well trusted. They probably work with half of that 1% of top brands. Blot out similarly. What's their background? They all came from Brave, the private browser company.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Mandar came from Brave. So they are lickety split smart as it pertains to, tracking cookies and unpacking data from, different domains or whatever. But you got to change your DNS settings to install their code. And, they're doing some hocus pocus that I don't think is entirely legitimate with 7-day cookies actually being 30-day cookies. And, I think there's some risks there tied to some of the privacy laws. Not to say, they have a compliant platform, but there's more risks of how that might change. And I also would imagine because they have an audience business, they would benefit from overcounting. So if I delete my cookies and now I get counted again, and then I show up on my laptop and I get counted again, if they're selling you a retarget audience and you have three users, that's good. In our system, we'd say, why did you count Noah 3 different times? That's bad. So I think there's a different set of what good looks like to blot out. Triple Whale, I'm going to be totally honest. I think they have a half-baked tool. They launched it prematurely. Every single person who's used it has said, well, the numbers look good for EMQ, but my ads are doing worse. I've seen head-to-head tests. It's not a great product. Having said that, it's V1. If you compared it to our V1 product from 3 years ago, it's probably just as good. But we're now on, our 10th iteration, as is Elevar, as is blot out, because we've been around a lot longer. So Triple Whale, it's free if you're on the enterprise tier. I think they rushed it to market, and I think they're kind of, as expected, struggling with some of those growing pains. And then Northbeam, I have huge respect for Northbeam. They have, a whole data science team. They're very rigorous. They're really not, they're not doing the same thing. So we're using straight CAPI. They're using this new CAPI that they developed with Meta. It's really about multi-touch attribution, getting fractional attribution. Again, that's not something our general customers are sophisticated enough to care about. We have a couple customers that are that big, but again, that's like a bigger brand problem. Like if you're spending 10 million on Meta, 10 million on Google, 3 million on TikTok, 5 million on affiliates, you're even doing TV and out of home, you're paying thousands a month for Northbeam, and you need to have
Yeah.
a very robust system to kind of slice and dice all those little micro conversions. So again, it's just we're selling to a different audience.
Yeah. Awesome. That
Hopefully
was
that wasn't disrespectful to anyone. I mean, again, we're all competitors. The short of it is, if you use any of those platforms, you're better off than using the free tools, the basic connectors. But again, we tried to build something that's really easy.
awesome. Yeah, this is a great breakdown. That is super helpful. I also thought, you had some hot-ish takes, but I thought it was pretty respectful. So
I mean, look, I have a lot of respect for these teams, and if anything, the more there's competition, it forces you as a business owner to A, play your A game and really build the best possible product, but B, figure out how to differentiate. I mean, you said it earlier, if the thing that you're doing isn't differentiated, you got to do something different.
yeah, yeah. Awesome. Well, that's all I got for questions. Is there anything else you would like to say, or any other comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, everyone in this industry, of all the competitors, we are competing against the free Shopify Cappy connection because there are millions of advertisers who have been misled by their Facebook rep to use that connection, and they were told it's good enough. I'm guessing that only 10% of the market is using an aftermarket Cappy. So ultimately, if you're using any of those brands, you're winning. If you're still using the Shopify Cappy, like, you really got to get something better in there. That's what
Yeah,
it boils down.
100% agree. It's kind of one of the easiest solutions we've implemented that's like significantly increased performance this year for a lot of the brands we implemented these. It's just been crazy. I mean, there's so much you can do on the creative testing side, product strategy side, all that. But just by doing this, just by getting something set up here, it significantly improved what we could do in terms of scaling up some of these brands. So yeah, it's a no-brainer at this point.
Great. Yeah, and I'd also say, better data isn't a magic trick. It's not a silver bullet. Most businesses see a 15 or 20% lift in ad performance, which is not insignificant. But really, great creative, you might see a 30% lift. Really well optimized landing pages, you might see another 30% lift.
Yeah,
Changing up and modernizing your campaign structure, you might see another 10, 20% lift. And then you add the data too. If you build up all four of those pillars of excellence, game over, man. Talk about alpha. At
yeah,
that point, you're untouchable. So, we see it as good data is part of that whole system. And for a lot of businesses, it's a blind spot. So, yeah.
awesome. I couldn't agree more. That's why those are our services. It's creative landing pages,
Yep.
media buying.
That's
So
it, man. That's
yeah,
it. I wish it
yeah,
were simpler, but you need all four.
yeah, yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, appreciate having you on, and yeah, I'll talk to you again some point soon.
Absolutely.